This is part 2 of the LeanChair Assembly video. This particular video is for those who want a left or counterclockwise opening desk only. In step 6, we're going to assemble the hinge. Everything here is going to be in box number 6. So take a hinge plate and hold it upright so that the semicircle is facing you and the opposite side is sloping downward. From the right side of the hinge plate, take a bolt and insert it into the upper hole that's nearest you, the bottom hole that's nearest you, and then the other bottom hole. Now place the 3 spacers onto each of these 3 bolts, and then put the other hinge plate onto the bolts. And once the bolts are through the left hinge plate, grab a bearing and make sure you orient it so that the set screws are face up. Place it flush against the left hinge plate, and then screw the bolts into the base of the bearing so that it's tight and flush against the left hinge plate. Once the bearing is attached, take the big bolt and insert it into the bearing from the bottom. And then onto the bolt, we're going to place a hinge strap, the large spacer, and then the other hinge strap. Now you're going to place the other bearing onto the bolt, but this time orient it so that the set screws are face down. This hinge has very tight tolerances, so you may need to maneuver it or jiggle it or maybe even use a rubber mallet to get this final bearing into place so that the bolts will go into the base. But once the threads start, use the yellow hex key to screw the bolts in. And the final bolt does not get a spacer. It's going to go through the actual LeanChair frame so that when it comes to time to install the hinge, we do not need a spacer. And finally, just put the black cap nut on top of the bolt and just hand tighten it. And that's the hinge. Step 7 is connecting the desk arm and the hinge to the LeanChair frame. And the first part of this process is to actually make the desk arm. The desk arm is comprised of the long desk tube, the middle desk tube, and the short desk tube. And you'll need the parts from box 7, which include 4 of these little short bolts and 4 flange nuts. And the way you connect these together is you put the bolt through the large hole on the long desk tube, push it through so that it goes through the small hole in the desk tube, and then through the weld plate on the middle desk arm. And then you cap it off with a flange nut. And you just do this on all the holes. So again, you take the hex key, you put it on the bolt, you run the bolt through the large hole on the long desk tube. You push it all the way through. It goes through the small hole and then through the hole in the middle desk tube, which you then cap off with a cap nut. You'll want to then make these really tight. Put the hex key in. You can use your fingers or you can use the double wrench that's included. And once you've done the long tube, you're going to now do the short tube. You put the large holes on the outside. Put a bolt on the hex key. Push it through the large hole so that the threads go through the small hole. And then through the hole in the weld plate of the middle tube, and then cap it off with a flange nut. That middle tube that has those plates welded to the ends, those plates are welded on 3 sides but not 4, and it's the unwelded side that you always want to face up. If you lose a bolt inside one of the tubes, it's not a problem to get out. You can just pop off one of the little plastic end caps and then just fish the little tube out. But once you get all the tubes in there and you've got all the, once you got all the bolts in there and you've got all the nuts attached, give it a good tighten. And now you're ready to move on to the next step, which is making the locking latch. To make a locking latch, you'll need the spring arm, the locking latch itself, and this little bag of parts. Take the long screw that's in the little bag of parts and put a washer on top of it. Run it through the locking latch as shown. Put another washer on the other side of the locking latch. Add the spring, and then push it through the spring arm, the little hole at the end of the spring arm. And then take a little plastic cap nut and cap it off. Now we're going to put the desk hinge onto the LeanChair frame, and the height where you put this hinge determines the height of the desk, so you'll want to experiment with that to get it right. And the first step is to unscrew that upper bolt that's furthest from you, because you're going to insert that through the LeanChair frame and then screw it back into the bearing once it's through the frame. And then once it's through, use the yellow hex key to tighten that bolt, to get that thread into the bearing and tighten it pretty well. Now you'll notice in box 7 there are two longer black bolts. One is a 3-inch bolt and one is a 2.5 inch. Take the longer, the 3-inch bolt, and run it through the hole second from the bottom. Run it through the frame into the hinge plates, and then tighten that up with a flange nut. Take the other bolt, the 2.5 inch one, run it through the bottom hole through the frame so that it comes out the hinge plate. Once it's through, add what we call the spring bracket, like that, and then affix this with another flange nut. Hold the bracket so that it's perpendicular to the floor. You can then use the double wrench, the small hole in the double wrench, and the yellow hex key on the opposite side to tighten these bolts and nuts up. The desk arm that you made earlier, you're going to slide that in between the two hinge straps on the desk hinge. If the bolts on the hinge are really tight, this is not going to work very well. You may need to loosen them up a bit to get the desk arm to slide in there. As I've said before, the tolerances on this desk hinge are quite tight, so it'll take a bit of maneuvering to get the desk arm to slide in there, but it will. Now, I usually keep a little rubber or a plastic mallet handy to help persuade that tube to go in. It just makes things a lot easier. And the goal here is to align the holes in the two hinge straps with the holes in the desk arm, because as you'll see shortly, there's a couple of chrome bolts that fit down into these holes. Once the chrome bolts are in, go ahead and take the locking latch that you made earlier, push it against the bottom of the lower hinge strap, and then push the chrome bolts through everything. And then take the 2 chrome locking nuts and attach them to the chrome bolts. And as you tighten these nuts up using the yellow hex key and the single black wrench, what you want to do is you want to push that locking latch toward the LeanChair itself, toward the LeanChair cushions, because you want that spring arm to be as close to the LeanChair cushions as you can, so that when you actually operate the locking latch, it'll go inside the spring bracket just fine. That'll make a lot more sense once we get to that step. But for now, as you're tightening these up, just try to make sure you push that locking latch assembly toward LeanChair, and don't let it get too far away from LeanChair. If you recall, when we were making the locking latch, we had a leftover small screw and a leftover black plastic cap nut. And we're going to use those now by putting the small screw through the hole in the spring bracket, then putting the spring over top of that screw, and then using the black plastic cap nut to cap that off. And also there was a little hex key, which you can now use to tighten that screw up. Now take both of the black wrenches, one on top and one on bottom of the big hinge bolt, put one on the bolt head and one on the cap nut, and give it a really good tighten. Now we're going to tighten up everything on the hinge. So go get the yellow hex key and just go all around the hinge, tightening up all the bolts, bringing them up to about 90 to 95% tight. There'll be plenty of opportunity to tighten up later, but for now we just want to get it really good and snug. And now for the final part of the hinge mechanism, we're going to open up the little magnet box, get the little magnet assembly out, and screw it onto the threads of the longer upper bolt that we inserted through the hinge plate. And as you can see, that will now keep the desk arm closed and secure. And now is a good opportunity to go back and tighten everything up really well. So grab that black wrench that has the single small hole. And the first ones you'll want to tighten up are these large frame bolts. These are the ones that went through the backrest assembly and into the lower frame tubes, way back in step 1. So you want to give those a good tighten. This uses the red hex key from box 1 and the black wrench from box 1. And then move on down to the gusset bolts, again with the red hex key and the single black wrench. Give everything a really good tighten on both sides. So now that we got the frame all good and secure, all that really remains is to create the desktop and to install it. So in box 7, you'll see a little plastic bag full of these desk screws and these sliding brackets which go on the underside of the desk. The underside of the desktop, you'll see these little holes that have been pre-drilled. So you'll put these little brackets in place, and then each bracket gets 5 of these small desk screws. Now don't tighten these up all the way, because once you get the brackets on there, you'll want to slide them onto the desk arm and kind of fiddle with it to make sure that you get the right level of friction, the right level of sort of in and out pressure that you prefer. So there's 5 holes that fit that bracket perfectly. You'll insert these 5 screws, and you may notice that below the brackets you'll see these other 2 little holes, and we'll deal with those in the end. But for now, just get these brackets screwed on. Again, I would say screw them about 70% tight, so that when you slide it onto the desk arm, you have the ability to slide these brackets together if you want to add more friction, or to slide them apart if you want to have less friction. But that's an individual choice. So now I'm going to take the desktop and slide it onto the desk arm. And this is where you'll adjust the friction, because it's friction that allows you to slide that desk in and out. So just fool with it until you get it just like you like it, and then tighten those screws back up. And finally, these last 2 screws. These are little bumper blocks, so to speak, that keep the desk from sliding off of the desk arm if you push it too far. And they have a little rubber washer so that it doesn't scratch up the desk arm. So do one side and then the other. And that's it for the desk. Now step 8, the final step, is completely optional. But in box 8, you'll find these little rubber strips that can go onto the outer gussets. And this is just to keep your floor from getting scuffed up. Or if you have like a slick surface, this allows you to have a little bit of friction on LeanChair. So there's 2 of these strips, one on either side of the outer gusset. And there's also this little bag of rubber 1-inch squares that are adhesive. And so those can actually go under the legs, under the LeanChair frame that we call the legs. And you just peel off these little stickers, like so, and then apply that sticky bit to the underside of LeanChair. I think there are 6 different places that I identify in the assembly manual that are ideal for putting these little stickers on there. Anyway, that just keeps a floor from getting scuffed up, and it's completely optional. If you're using this on carpet, you don't need to do that. And there is your completed LeanChair. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you for watching. Good luck with your assembly. Thanks.